Hi, and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rasool, and we are doing something different today. We are at the SVRI, the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, where more than 100 organizations from around the world have gathered to showcase their work on sexual violence. There are workshops, people are exhibiting, there's a lot going on here. So before we get into some deep conversations with some people about the amazing work, we are going to go find out who is here and what they are doing. So let's go have a look.
My name is Shesheenah Bray. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Director of Programs and Partnerships at MeToo International. MeToo International is a Black feminist organization located in the United States working to disrupt and eradicate sexual violence by uplifting and illuminating the experience of Black women and girls in the U.S. But we're also internationally based, and so while we're located in the U.S., we understand that the experience of Black women and girls is not singular to the U.S., and so it's important that our struggle is connected with the struggles of women in the global South. And so we have a global network as well that allows us to combine our resources, allows us to share ideas and best practices as to how we eliminate the issue of sexual violence. We are here to provide more information about the work that we're doing. We take an approach of healing and action. We understand that healing is an action in of itself, and for some survivors, that will be their first action is their own healing, and that's something we advocate. And so we're here sharing our healing resources. We have a self-guided healing platform called Survivor Sanctuary. It's completely free. We encourage you to check it out, sanctuary.metoomovement.org. We also have narrative campaigns to help bring awareness to the issue of sexual violence, helping people to understand that sexual violence is a public health crisis, not only in the US, but also globally. And then as I mentioned before, we started a global network in this past February that is, again, allowing us to combine and to really bring together the issues of sexual and gender-based violence beyond US borders. Take a breath, right? I think being able to, one, remember your own humanity first and foremost and think about your safety and security as you move through the world would be the first thing. I'd also say stay encouraged. You are not alone in the work that you are doing. There are many of us who have the same aspirations, who have the same convictions, and also having the same types of experiences. And so know that you're not alone. It's also okay to take a break, right? We can't say take care of yourself and then say keep going, keep going, keep going. And so it's okay to take a break. It's okay to take care of yourself. It's okay to prioritize your needs. There's much work to be done, and there's many of us to do it. And so I would say, please take good care of yourself so that we can sustain ourselves in this work.
Hi, my name is Jessica Gorham, and I'm the Regional Emergency GBV Advisor. I'm based at UNFPA, but I work on UNFPA's mandate to coordinate gender-based violence in emergencies in humanitarian settings. So I cover East and Southern Africa, and we ensure that at the onset of emergency all the way to the recovery phase that there are life-saving services available for survivors of gender-based violence. And those services look like health, so for instance that there's clinical management of rape, psychosocial support, case management, legal services, protection services. So the GBV AOR, or the Gender-Based Violence Area of Responsibility, is a consortium of organizations that provide these life-saving services. Well, if you can imagine what the scale of gender-based violence is in times of peace, let's amplify that by 100. When we talk about gender-based violence in humanitarian settings, it's always exacerbated because of some of the characteristics of violence. When we have people on the move, we have, systems that have been dismantled. And so this is where we really have to think about protecting women more so sometimes even than in development phases, because we don't have the infrastructure or the safety nets, right? The social safety nets are available. So we as humanitarians try and build up those safety nets so that women and girls are safe during these really super complex times. We're also really stressing today with our affirmation station that it's really about also taking care of yourselves before we can take care of others. And I think as GBV specialists and implementers that we don't often think and do that. And so I want everybody to know to take these affirmations home and really read them every day and be them, because we need you out there doing this frontline work. So thanks for having me.
Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are shooting from the SVRI, Sexual Violence Research Initiative. And joining me now is Emma Fulu, who is a researcher, feminist activist, and executive director at the Equality Institute, a global feminist agency working to advance gender equality and end violence against women and girls, and also the co-founder of Voice, a non-profit organization that partners with women and girls in conflict and disaster settings to amplify solutions in their communities. Please help me to welcome her. So Emma, welcome. And can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a researcher by background, and I've worked all over the world looking at violence against women and how we can prevent it. And then in 2015, I founded my own organization called the Equality Institute. And I really wanted to bring together sort of a holistic solution to this issue. So, how do we do the research, but then how do we communicate that research and so that it actually informs policy and practice and creates the change that we want to see?
So as you can see, we're sharing a mic. So bear with us on the other side because we are shooting from the SVRI conference. Emma, thank you so much for that. I mean, there's always a deep disconnect between the research and then the work on the ground sometimes. And so maybe you can tell us some of the work, some of the research that Equality Institute does and what the kinds of ways that you are tackling violence against women and girls. And I think earlier we were saying there's a focus on prevention.
Yes, exactly. So we focus on prevention, which, exists within the ecosystem of everything that we need to do on this issue, from, response, early intervention to healing. But the prevention side is really looking at what are the root causes of gender-based violence, and then what types of programs and policies can address those root causes to stop violence happening in the first place. So our aim is actually to, fundamentally reduce the prevalence rates of violence. So we do research, for example, to deeply understand the issue and how it plays out in different cultural contexts. So that might include, we've done prevalence studies in different countries that look at the rates of different types of violence, but also the drivers of that violence. So, often we find, it relates to a multitude of factors, things around gender inequality, but also childhood trauma, histories of conflict, mental health issues. We've even seen relationships more recently with climate change, for example. So it's really research to understand the issue is one body of work. And then we do a whole nother body of research that's looking at what works. So we look at doing evaluations of programs. And seeing, what change are they creating, what's working about them, what's not working about them, and how can we develop the most effective programs that we can, basically.
Thank you. I love that. It's sort of multifaceted and very extensive. When you're speaking about root causes, and so this is a two-part question. One, it's, what are some of those root causes? It's always sort of interesting to find. And I know you can't go into all of that, obviously, but what are some of the broader root causes of violence against women that you see in the research? And then also, before the Equality Institute, you worked on a multi-country study on men and violence. And I'm asking that alongside root causes because now there's a broader narrative saying we need to include men in this conversation. We need to, in which ways do men factor in with root causes? Because before it was, like it's a woman's issue.
Great question. So I'll start with the original sort of, the research initially when we were looking at women's experiences, and the field has done a lot of research with women and understood sort of what's driving their experiences. And it kind of falls into a few broad buckets. So fundamentally, it is underpinned by gender inequality and power imbalances within society. But then that is also layered, of course, with, if we take in what we would call an intersectional lens, that not all women experience the same level of disempowerment. So Black women, women of colour, women with disabilities, queer women, for example, experience multiple forms of discrimination, which make them at a higher risk of experiencing violence. Then we have these sort of other factors that come into play. If they have experienced violence as children, they're more likely to experience violence. If they witness their own mother experiencing violence, they're more likely to end up being a victim or survivor. There's relationships we know with mental health. There's relationships with gender attitudes, with levels of education. So there's sort of a few sets of risk factors. The men's question is really, really interesting. And what happened was we'd done all this research with women, but then we thought, this isn't just a women's problem. The primary perpetrators are men. And if we don't understand what's driving men's use of violence, how are we ever going to stop it in the first place? So we actually did a UN multi-country study with 10,000 men across 6 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. So, and it was a random sample household quantitative survey, also with qualitative research. But it was really looking at rates of perpetration, but also the drivers of men's use of violence. And again, we found these broad buckets, really strong drivers around gender inequality. So men who hold gender inequitable attitudes, men who have dominant sort of ideas of masculinity that are associated with toughness and control and violence, but also their own childhood trauma. So a very strong driver is around men's own experiences of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse as children. And then also a set of factors around, so if they were involved in other forms of violence outside the home, so gang violence, other fights with weapons, so which we think relates to this idea of masculinity and dominance and toughness. And then again, still factors around education, mental health, and socioeconomic status came into play, but they were less significant than the masculinity, gender inequality factors. Yeah.
That is very interesting. Someone said to me the other day that, and she's a survivor, and she had published a book, and she said to me that her mother used to beat her when she was young as a form of discipline, and it normalized it for her. And so when her partner was beating her, she completely thought that it was okay. And the fascinating thing was when her mother would speak to her about it not being okay, she would say, but why, it made her question, but why was it okay for you to beat me and it's not okay for him to beat me? So really interesting from a sort of context perspective.
Yes.
I want to ask you, so you're also the co-founder of Voice, that partners with women and girls in conflict and disaster settings to amplify solutions. Can you tell us a little bit about that research?
So we know that in conflict and disaster settings, women, that we often see an increase in rates of gender-based violence and increase in rates of sexual violence. But a lot of the work in that setting, historically has been led by big sort of international agencies and emergency response, and often the issues of women and girls are not prioritized. So it's like, okay, water and sanitation and those things, and sexual and gender-based violence and safety and women's issues often got marginalized. And it's like, okay, we'll deal with that after the emergency. But actually women and girls are telling us, no, this is as important, as water, safety. If we don't have this, and their lives are literally, at risk. And so this sort of organization was really founded to center and have women and girls who are experiencing these things be leading the solutions, because they're the ones that have the answers. And so it was trying to really disrupt the way that work had historically been done. I think one of some research that's come out of the conflict settings recently is, interestingly, there was a lot of focus on sexual sort of conflict-related sexual violence. But in many cases, we actually still find that the most common form of violence is still intimate partner violence, even in a conflict setting. So it's not just that sexual violence goes up, that's directly, conflict-related sexual violence, but intimate partner violence also increases during times of conflict and disaster and disruption. And that's because of lots of reasons, triggers around stress and insecurity, but also some of these disasters, they reinforce often harmful gender norms and stereotypes and put women in very vulnerable situations, and then they're more marginalized. So it's really I guess a context where it really becomes even more serious in many cases, and that's why we felt like we had to work on it.
Thank you so much, Emma. That's fascinating. It's making me think about some of the stories of gender-based violence that are emerging in South Africa post-apartheid are stories from women who were part of the struggle that experienced violence, including sexual violence, from comrades in the same struggle. And there was, I remember reading about during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is really held up as this, amazing thing in this beacon, and it was part of our peaceful pathway out of apartheid and into the democracy. However, women's stories and gender-based violence wasn't really allowed informally into that space. Is this, I think I'm trying to ask also, this is an extra element. It's an extra danger that people have that we don't really think about, because the way it's framed in media often is that we're worried about the enemy, yes, right? But do you see this as well?
Yeah, the enemy is within, sadly, in many cases. The interesting another piece of research we're working on at the moment with a group called the Weave Collective is actually looking at women's organizations and feminist movements across, the last 50 plus years, and their contribution to the gender-based violence prevention work. And it includes South Africa, Nicaragua, India, and Indigenous communities in Australia. And interestingly, in many of the 4 countries, but including South Africa, one of the findings is that often the movements are, the women's movements are often connected to other social justice movements, so racial justice, democracy, anti-colonization movements, for example. But what often happened in those movements is that the women's issues were deprioritized. So say that, and it's exactly what you were talking about. It was women were in those movements, but they were told, your issues around sexual violence or other women's rights issues, they're not as important right now. We have to focus on this. We have to focus on democracy, or we have to focus on, colonization, or we have to focus on something else. And so they were holding this double burden, and then at the same time, the women's movements that were also going on, white women's movements, ignored their issues as well. So they were sort of left they were part of both, but no one actually really valued that kind of sometimes called double jeopardy, or the double burden that they were facing. So it's exactly what you're saying, and often it was perpetrated violence they were experiencing was not just by the state but also within their own community. Yeah,
that's a very important thing. And I think I'm thinking about Audre Lorde, in which she spoke about also the race struggle, yeah, versus the violence struggle, and the race struggle always came first, yes, because if you accused what is the double bind? If you accused a fellow black man of this type of violence, and then you were almost proving the accusations that were being made against them. Yeah. And I think we see the same thing in families, right? And so that's also the thing here. You have to protect the name of the family. Yes. I want to jump to we at the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, and part of the purpose of this conference is to highlight the importance of research and the impact that it can have. And I think you were speaking about impact on policy and so forth. I mean, it's always a question. We think about it a lot, about how it plays out on the ground. I just want to ask you, and so how is the research important? How important is it to play into policy? I know it's a big question, but what does it mean? What is it important for us on the ground to know?
I mean, I think it's absolutely incredibly important. It's really a central part of how we have, historically gotten things on a political agenda and created change. And actually this research has shown that research has been used as a tool of advocacy across the movements. So if we think about violence against women, for a long time, it was considered a private, family issue. And it was research that decades of research led by women and survivors in many cases proved the high prevalence rates of it, which is where we get the 1 in 3 and the other statistics, that it was a public health issue, that it had these long-term impacts on physical, sexual, and reproductive health, that it was an economic issue, that it was costing governments billions of dollars. That was research that proved that, and those were the sort of findings that were then used to advocate to get national plans, to get, violence against women on the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, to get, to get funding and to ideally, hopefully, get funding back down to the grassroots movements that are doing the work as well. So for me, it works well when research is connected to activism and research is connected to movement building, that they're not separate, that they're really integrated. And I think the Weave Collective is an excellent example of that, just because many of us are both. We're researchers, but we also consider ourselves activists, and we've been activists in the movement for decades. We just happen to also do that, and we like to bring those things together. So, I mean, I've seen many examples over the time of a really powerful impact of research, and I think that's why SVRI is so important, because we're always learning, right? And we have to, this issue, we haven't solved it yet. So we have to keep learning. We have to keep trying new things. We have to keep experimenting. We have to keep, digging deeper. And that's why all of this emerging research from around the world, like there's hundreds of countries represented here. It's just so important to take our work forward.
Thank you so much, Emma. And I think that just the fact that we have like this huge conference, this huge global conference around a topic like sexual violence. I mean, just yesterday I was speaking somewhere and I was saying, it is nobody speaks about it, even, in the home, in their like littlest level. And here we are sharing this research. So that's progress, right? It's moving the needle. I want to ask you, I think we have 2 minutes. Any last words?
I mean, I guess I would just say that I think what I love about places like this is you see, and yes, it is like on the agenda, and that it's breaking that silence to have, 1,500 people in a room like talking about this. But I also really think that it's everyone's role to be addressing sexual and gender-based violence. It impacts all of us in one way or another, even if it's not directly you personally. But I feel like we all benefit from a world where we can be safe and equal and live with dignity and liberation. And I just always want to encourage everyone to be a part of that solution, because it actually benefits you as well. And so I just come on the journey with us.
Thank you so much. That was Emma Fulu, Executive Director of the Equality Institute. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are shooting from the SVRI, the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. And joining me now is Daniela Ligiero, who is the Chief Executive Director of Together for Girls, to end violence against children and adolescents, particularly sexual violence, and also the founder of the Bray movement in 2022, which is survivor-led advocacy. Daniela, please tell us more about the work by Together for Girls and the work that you do.
First of all, thank you so much for having me here today. It's such a pleasure, and thank you for the work that you do. It's so important. I run Together for Girls. That is a global organization that works on ending all forms of violence against children and adolescents, especially sexual violence. And we work with a combination of data and research plus advocacy to drive action. We believe that that combination of having the data, having the evidence, the numbers, and then activism and advocacy can really help create change when it comes to the issue of childhood sexual violence. And at this point, we are working in multiple countries, including in Sub-Saharan Africa and regions like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, North America, and then starting to do a little bit more in Southeast Asia. And I always like to say, this is a problem that is truly universal, and every single country in the world has still not figured out how to solve it. And so there's a need for the work everywhere. And more importantly, it needs to be led by the people in those countries creating the change.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's such admirable work. Before the break, we were speaking, I was asking our previous guest about the importance of research. And we are at the SVRI that focuses on research. I wanted to ask, it's really interesting because sexual violence against children is one thing that, I mean, sexual violence in general is really difficult to talk about. It's almost, even though we know sexual violence against children happens, it's almost unheard of. It's so silent. Do you think we recognize the scale of the problem?
The answer is no. And that's why the research we do is so important, because what we find over and over again, and we do these big, large, what we call population based surveys that really tell you about what's happening at a country level. And over again, what we find is that the majority of children and adolescents don't even disclose. So they don't even tell someone. So if you start to look just at what's showing up at the services like health or justice, you're only getting the tip of the iceberg. And part of that is that there's still so much shame and stigma and silence around the issue that we know that a lot of children and adolescents don't come forward because they feel like they've done something wrong. And in the cases when they do, and you know this well, the systems, the people in their lives aren't really set up to believe them and to make sure that they get the support that they need. And so what we've done is done quite a lot of research to show the magnitude of the problem. We know that the numbers vary depending on country, anywhere from, when you look at girls, 1 in 4, all the way to 1 in 10 girls experience some form of sexual violence before their 18th birthday. And unfortunately, we've also realized over time, because we started just looking at girls, that boys also experience sexual violence, and there's a lot of silence around that too. The numbers aren't as high as girls, but they're still significant. And I think that is another important learning for us, where there are these cycles of violence that are happening, and that really there's a need to think about the life course and understand what's happening earlier on so that we can prevent it from continuing to happen into adulthood.
Thank you so much for that. One of the things that you touched on, and one of the things that I really focused on when we started the Womxn Show was, and that was surprising to me, was a low conviction rate for sexual assault. So, and it's low all over. And so I often say, since you work with survivors and also, in the Brave movement, which is survivor led, one of the things I think about is, wow, in South Africa, for instance, we have around 50,000 reports of sexual assault every year. And those are only the ones that are reported. And we have less than 5,000 convictions. And so when I tell people this, and even in the sector, in gender-based violence, a lot of people are surprised by the statistic because it's not everywhere. It's hardly anywhere. I just found it out because I went looking for it. But what it made me think of was like, wow, over 90%, over 40,000 survivors had to just go back home and with no justice and sort of just deal with it or get over it. Tell us about the Brave movement. Is that one of the elements that it helps to address?
Yeah, so Brave is a global movement of survivors and allies focused on ending all forms of sexual violence in childhood. And we use what we call a survivor-centered framework, which is prevention, healing, and justice. And we believe that those three things cannot exist on their own. They have to, it's interconnected. You can't have one without the other. So justice is absolutely essential, as is healing and as is prevention. And, the reason I founded this movement about 2 years ago is because I'm a survivor myself of childhood sexual abuse. And I made the decision, almost 15 years ago now, to start sharing that publicly, because I felt, if I'm this educated, empowered woman and I'm ashamed or scared to talk about what happened to me, how can we ever expect the most vulnerable to come forward? I don't think it's a choice for everyone. Not everyone should come forward, but having done that, I was able to meet leaders from around the world who were also survivors and also creating change. And we came together to start the Brave movement, to do survivor-centered advocacy and activism to demand justice. I mean, because the numbers you're describing in South Africa are not unique. Anywhere you go, it's the same thing. And similarly, we're not doing prevention. We're not even starting earlier on to stop these things from happening in the first place. And we know that the the best practices are out there, the evidence is out there on what works. We're just not doing it. It's a political issue.
Thank you so much. I want to ask about you. You said you were speaking about disclosures. So we know, and the research also shows that a lot of children don't disclose. They think they did something wrong. They are often blamed for it, particularly girls who find themselves in the room with some of the. I used to go through court records, and it was interesting how many girls would be blamed for being in a room alone with a grown person or man. But some of the more interesting cases that I have heard about, both through survivors who have published their memoirs, is sometimes they do disclose, or the parents do find out, and they hide it. So there's an active system within the home to hide that. And I'm just going to throw something out there. I read a book the other day with the mother of a child who was sexually assaulted, who wrote a letter about how they tried to deal with that sexual assault internally, because both parents were working and the grandparents they couldn't disrupt the daily life. And it seems so, and she admits, it seems impossible now to consider that, but those were taken into consideration when we decided what to do about this. What can you say about cases where it is disclosed, but it is hidden away or buried, so to speak?
Well, that's the other reason it's so important to have data and evidence. So what we find over and over again is that about 50% of girls, and actually disclosure rates are lower for boys, 60% of boys on average, never tell anyone. But those that do, actually very few of them end up in the justice system or getting any kind of service, whether it's health or mental health. It drops to like 2-3%, a little like the numbers you were describing. So there's a first gap that we talk about the gaps. The first gap is disclosure. So what is the system that is created around people where children and adolescents are felt like they can't even talk about it? What is that about? And how are we not creating a space where we're talking regularly to children and adolescents about this, that this can happen and that they know what to do if it does or if they're scared? We don't do that, right? So that's the first gap. And then the second gap is once they disclose, the majority of times people ignore it, people try to cover it up. I mean, there are lots of reasons. Sometimes it has to do with, as you mentioned, like in the family, and there might be issues around honor and parents feeling overworked, and this sense in some countries where the family's honor is at stake versus the person that perpetrated the crime's honor being at stake. But then there are also issues, for example, we know in religious organizations, in the Catholic Church, we've seen scandals over and over again around the world, and that's buried. We've seen it in sports over and over again, all the way up to the Olympics, and it gets buried. So wherever it's happening, these systems are operating where it's all the same root. We're blaming the victim, and we're not really, making sure that the shame belongs to the perpetrators and to the systems that allow that kind of abuse to happen.
Thank you so much, Daniela. We are out of time, but I think, I just want to thank you so much for all of that. I think those insights will resonate with a lot of our audiences out there, those who have been through it, but hopefully the family members around them and the systems around them will also listen to the things that you've said. So thank you so much. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are shooting from the SVRI, the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. And with me now is Antara Ganguli from the United Nations Girls Education Initiative. And can you please join me in welcoming Antara? So Antara, welcome to The Womxn Show, and please tell us, what is it that you do?
Thank you so much for having me here. I have to say South Africa is one of the best countries in the world to be working on ending violence against women and against children. The UN Girls Education Initiative works for gender equality in and through education, which means using the powerful, powerful world of schools to help children become, let's face it, better adults than we have been on gender equality.
I love that. Antara, there is an initiative going on right now. There's something, I've seen an open letter being passed around wanting people to sign. Can you tell us what that is all about?
Of course. We believe that every child needs to learn that no means no. We also believe that for that to happen, schools need to be a safe and nurturing place for every child. Next month in Bogota, the world is seeing its first ever ministerial conference on ending violence to children. Yet, sexual violence is not considered as much as it should be, especially in education settings. So, our open letter is to get ministers to commit to ending and preventing sexual violence in all its forms, in all kinds of education settings. And by the way, that also means on the route to schools.
Yeah. I love that. And we know that sexual, I mean, I've heard cases where we've had hectic stories, but schools are also often a place where kids disclose sometimes about sexual violence that is going on at home and that's going on in other spaces. And Tara, before we started this interview, you also said that you work sometimes with teachers who also experience harassment and sexual violence. Can you tell us about that?
Of course, look, people who watch your show know this better than anybody else. We live in a patriarchal world. All of us are subject to really cruel norms of power, which lead to violence. So this also happens in schools where sometimes, whether it's a woman teacher, the woman who cleans the bathroom or the toilet, sometimes a woman bus driver, they're also subject to sexual violence, to sexual harassment, and we don't really talk about that. It's interesting because when that happens to a government employee by another government employee, then that's actually breaking the laws of the country as a government employee. But we rarely think about it in those terms. So we're trying to raise awareness that every person who is in an education setting deserves to live their life free from any kind of violence.
Thank you so much. And I think I hadn't thought of it that way either. And Terry, I want to ask, so when you say every child needs to, everyone needs to understand that no means no, do you think that there's education around, education that is lacking in schools around sexual violence? I mean, still, it is difficult. I see intergenerationally how difficult it is. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and we're just about at the point where we can name the body parts exactly what it is and we can break societal norms. And I'm teaching my mother alongside my 10-year-old daughter, but it is still really difficult to talk about sex and sexual violence. What more needs to be done to educate?
I love that intergenerational story of you, your daughter, and your mother. I think that's beautiful. And I think that's teaching your daughter that it's a forever journey of learning. And it's also teaching her the strong power that you and your mother are bringing to that. I think it all starts with consent. We want children as they grow older in age appropriate ways to learn that sex is not something to be frightened of, it's not something to be ashamed of, but it has to start with consent. And we usually think that that's important for boys to learn, and it is, but it's also important for girls to learn. And girls often don't learn that. So when they're 12, 13, sometimes even younger, there's so much pressure to be popular. There's so much pressure to be cool. There's so much pressure to act like they know everything that sometimes they say yes or act yes when they actually don't know that it's okay to say no, that in fact it's better for them to say no. So consent is really the starting point of everything. We have this poster, which we are really proud of because it shows that no child was born wanting to harm another human being. You never see a baby crawling over to another baby to hit them. What is it that we are teaching them that they are learning this aggression towards each other? So that's what we work on.
I love that. Can I just say the last time the SVRI was in Cape Town, which was quite a few years ago, I remember there was this one presentation that stuck with me. I think it was Australia, and the researchers were saying that they had found with the rise in social media and technology that young people were now getting their sex education from porn, from online porn, not boys and girls, and it seems like this big step backwards. And I see also, because I have a 10-year-old, because all of the parents are discussing, when I look at what's out there, aside from the popular, even I worry about, because even the popular makeup videos look almost sexualized these days. So I just want to get your thoughts on social media and technology.
Listen, I'm so glad you're asking this question. It's literally the thing that keeps me up at night. So many children, especially boys, learn about sex from the most violent, misogynistic porn. And so imagine here's this 9-year-old, 10-year-old mind. Maybe he's beginning to feel sexual urges for the first time, maybe he's not. But the first thing he encounters is a man behaving horribly to a girl or a woman. So no matter what comes at him after that, even if he goes to an excellent school where they teach him great things about consent, that first image is going to stay in his mind. Now here is the absolute kicker for me. We have not even measured this as a community. And yet, every time I speak to a person who works on the ground with boys, with schools, if I ask them, where do you think boys first learn about sex? Without a doubt, no matter which country in the world, they'll say through porn. And we haven't measured this. We are doing nothing about this.
Antara, we are out of time. You've raised such important points. I just want to say thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. And that is this interview for now. Please stay tuned because we are coming back with more. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are still reporting from the SVRI Forum, the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. And as you've heard throughout the show, we have interviewed stakeholders from various international organizations who work against gender-based violence and to end violence against women and children. Now we are almost at the end of the show, but before we go, we're going to play a short video from one of the projects that are launching at the SVRI. It's from the Weave project, the Weave Collective. Weaving stories from the margins. Let's go have a look.
History is all about what's documented. And sometimes things go undocumented. What we try to surface in this research is to make the invisible visible, making it visible again.
My name is Carol Bauer. And in 1976, 5 women, of which I was not one, got together and decided to start some kind of service for women who'd been raped. The term marital rape was a contradiction in terms. Sex within marriage was specifically defined in law as his right and her responsibility. So theoretically, or at least legally, a married woman could not be raped by her husband. That is no longer the case.
Hi, I am Brenda Madumis, Director at Wise for Africa, a non-profit organization that focuses on gender equality and equity advocacy work and gender-based violence. My early days of the ANC was a discussion on women's rights and how we ensure that those rights are entrenched in the ANC policy work. And once the ANC got into government, the first work was on the termination of pregnancy that came before Parliament, because we had worked on that and we believed in women's reproductive health and that women have got the right to choose. And so that was the first critical policy work that we undertook and took it to Parliament to ensure that you have what we now have, the Termination of Pregnancy Act.
Hello everyone, my name is Caroline Peters. I'm an African feminist and human rights defender. I'm the founder and executive director of Palace Foundation. Foundation. So in the early days of the Western Cape Network on Violence Against Women, there wasn't a Domestic Violence Act yet. Even though, so from the late 98 it started, it says, but we know how many years it took to be implemented. I think the year 2000, etc. So we were part of being able to shape the Domestic Violence Act as civil society. So we had focus groups, different groups of women. The Western Cape Network on Violence Against Women was made up of different regions, and every region had a representative at the Network on Violence Against Women. The committee was established like that. Every woman's voice was heard. Violence against women was not a personal, private matter, that it affected everybody. So there was lots of education to be had at the time.
I'm Yolanda Gangi, an African feminist and award-winning social entrepreneur. So as a student activist at Rhodes University, particularly in my second year, this was in 2016, myself and a number of students mobilized under the hashtag RU Reference List, which was a campaign and a sporadic campaign, a sporadic movement that erupted on the 18th of April 2016, essentially responding to the crisis of rape culture and sexual and gender-based violence at our university campus. In an age where obviously traditional media has been the most popular, the common platform used to share, information at such a large scale, we then opted to use, what was within our reach, which were our phones, our laptops, to not only just, tell the story, but also to share the visuals, the actual live action, the actual pushback, the state violence that students were up against. We were able to archive, these experiences.
My name is Peli Sankomo. I am a development economist, gender equity expert. I classify myself as a social scientist. When I talk about my gender-based violence or violence against women experience, I mean, for me, I remember the fact that I'm raised by a single parent who was semi-skilled, who worked as a clerk in Butterworth in the Eastern Cape in a textile industry. Alone, we moved from different houses because the system would not allow where we were in Butterworth forcing women to actually own houses. Even though she was working, she had acquired a massive amount of experience in the factory, but she could have never been promoted to be a clerk. There are certain things that have changed post-democratic dispensation. I think I must not acknowledge, and I must acknowledge that, in fact, I have benefited from a democratic dispensation, but there's a lot that needs to be done. I applaud and women and feminists of this country, gender justice activists, for the work that they've done in as far as the gender-based violence and femicide interventions. In fact, we're probably one of the first countries in Africa that has really designed a very concise policy document that seeks to deal with gender-based violence. It's true that you will get, a section of communities or members of society who said we're not consulted. But in fact, that strategy, it's so comprehensive. I mean, if you look at the 6 things it deals with accountability and leadership. So it's about how do we get leaders accountable and lead openly the conversation on gender-based violence.
Follow.
That was a short video from the Weave Project, and we are still here at the SVRI, the Sexual Violence Research Initiative Forum, and we are about to say goodbye. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lenina Rasool. Goodbye.